In the previous video, I briefly demoed the use of an equalization or EQ effects to modulate the frequency spectrum of various drum tracks, a bass drum, a snare, and a cymbals. Today, I'm going to go into greater detail on how you might use an equalizer to balance frequency dynamics across a multitude of instruments as they each occupy different zones of the frequency spectrum. And to demo that, I have here the original mix for the song The Bridge and the multitudes of tracks that ended up being recorded for this production, which, as you can see, there's 30 different tracks. This is a huge song. It's got lots of parts, so there's a lot to talk about. In audio production, we work within a frequency range of about 0 hertz to around 25,000 hertz. This plugin in Reaper that I use for equalization allows us to modulate frequencies up to about 24,000 hertz. This covers the entire audible frequency range of the human ear, which is thought to be between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz. This differs slightly from person to person, and the range decreases with age, especially on the high end, as the cilia or hairs in your ear, which serve to detect these frequencies, gradually lose sensitivity over time. This is where the mosquito sound comes into play. The frequency spectrum is often subdivided into 3 zones, which you may be familiar with in the context of guitar tone. You have the bass region, the mid region, and the treble region. In music theory, there are defined cutoffs based on the frequency of middle C, but the definition is kind of arbitrary. From a practical standpoint, it's based on how you hear things, and the lines can be blurred from one range to the next. One thing is certain in that we do not subdivide this entire spectrum evenly. You might notice that the spectrum is displayed on a log scale, meaning we have a lot more sensitivity in modulating the lower frequencies than we do at the higher end, where those frequencies tend to be noisy and not particularly functional. This is simply the nature of how tonal frequencies are defined. The relationship of how frequencies increase from one octave to the next is non-linear, but none of this is actually important. Anyway, the bass range is what I would consider to be anything below 300 hertz. This is where the bass drum, the toms, and the bass guitar naturally likes to sit. Let me show you again what the raw spectrum of my kick drum looks like. As I play this track, you can see that it peaks at about 50 hertz, and the upper end of the full width half max of this peak kind of levels out around 200 hertz. Now let's switch gears from the kick tom and look at something different, the bass track instead. First, I have to explain that the instrument I use to record my bass track is an acoustic electric bass guitar, and I'm recording it 100% acoustically by holding it right up against the microphone. This was done using a dynamic mic and not a condenser, which is much more sensitive to low volumes. So the audio track that I record is actually very quiet, as you can tell from this waveform, and requires a lot of volume modulation after the fact to get it to the same level as the rest of the tracks. Also, I'm playing with my fingers only, as all real bass players do, and because the track ends up being so quiet, you can hear a lot of things like strings squeaking on the high end that I would want to get rid of with an equalizer. Now, I'm going to open the FX window. Don't be alarmed when you see 6,000 compressor effects. Only 2 of these are actually active, the first and the second compressors. The remaining 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 compressors exist solely for me to boost volume by turning up the unprocessed wet signal on what is otherwise an empty effect. This is really the most straightforward way that I found to do this in Reaper. But we're not really here to talk about compressors, just equalization. Because this is an acoustic instrument, the frequency spectrum we're about to see when I play the unprocessed signal is not representative of what an electric bass that's driven through an amp would look like. Acoustic basses are going to have a lot more treble, and part of what I have to do is use EQ to deepen my sound. There are 2 reasons I use an acoustic bass. It didn't make sense for me to buy an electric one and have to get new gear like another expensive amp just to produce a decent sound. And I just kind of like the idea of recording black metal with an acoustic bass and being one of few people to really do it. It has a very unique sound, and I think it actually works very well in black metal. There was just something charming about being able to experiment with something that's not really oftenly done. And I'm very happy with the results. Now, as far as sound goes, I love a hand-plucked upright bass, especially in jazz. And actually my reference for EQing the bass was to mimic Charles Mingus, who's one of the greatest jazz bassists of all time, if not the greatest. So using an acoustic bass guitar to record my tracks makes it pretty easy to get close to that sound. I just have to deepen the low end. But before we get into all of that, let's look at this unprocessed frequency spectrum. And I'll turn on some of these compressor effects to get that volume up to a level that makes sense. That's a little bit too loud. Okay, so I'm going to talk through as it plays. We can see that this track kind of peaks around 200 hertz and gradually falls off to around 1000 hertz, where after the fact it just tails off really sharply. So in order to make this instrument sound more like an upright bass, I really have to focus on boosting this low end, this everything below 300 hertz range, which is what I define as the bass region, particularly for this reason. And what I'm basically going to do is scoop out the rest. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn on all my other effects. As you can see, the shape of this EQ is boosted at about 50 to 200 hertz. And then everything else is just scooped out really hard. So let me play that same exact track. Make it a little bit louder. So this is the actual effect that I ended up using on the final mix of the bridge. I'm going to skip over the other specifics on mixing bass for now, as this video is just focused on using the EQ FX. That really has to wait until I've gone over compression and all the other subjects I plan on talking about in this series, because the way everything comes together matters. In the meantime, that's my quick and dirty scoop on what I consider to be the bass range of the frequency spectrum. On the other side, we have treble. Treble is generally everything around 2000 hertz and higher. Now, personally, I might even consider 1500 hertz and be kind of the bottom end of the treble region. At the highest end, the 10,000 hertz and above range, it's really just noise. That those frequencies don't contribute much to your actual sound quality. For standard instruments like guitar, the functional treble range probably ends around 5000 hertz. So in fact, now's a really good time to go look at my guitar tracks. For this song, I used 4 primary rhythm guitar tracks. I have one that I call left mid, which is panned far right and EQ boosted in this mid treble range. The complementary track to this I call right treb, which is panned far right and boosted kind of in this mid treble region. I use these tracks for the sections that are based on power chords and chugs. Anywhere where I want a really heavy sound, I've boosted more towards the low end of my guitars. Now those tones are more appropriate for something like traditional metal or doom metal, and this bridge starts off kind of like that way. It starts off with a lot of slow power chords and heavier sections, but it gradually builds up, of course, into black metal. And I do have 2 tracks for that, one titled Left Black, which is panned centered left and boosted in the high treble range, and that's complemented by the track Right Black, which is panned center right and boosted more in the mid treble range. These 2 guitar tracks are primarily for black metal riffs with lots of tremolo picking and harmonies, you know, the 2-note chord kind of riffs. And the high end boost is necessary to provide the clarity to hear the melodies, the melodic component of those black metal riffs, as I talked about in the core concept of my most famous video titled The Functional Significance of Tone in Black Metal Guitar. Since we're talking about the treble range right now, I'm going to display the window to my left black FX, which has the strongest treble boost. Inherently, the guitar track was recorded raw with a setup that allows it to have the most treble. I tracked this with my bridge pickup on the guitar and the tone knob at max position. In contrast, my left mid track was natively tracked with the pickup in the mid position and the tone knob dialed back to around 60% to give it a little bit more low end. Also, I want to mention first that I recorded these rhythm guitar tracks directly by plugging the output line of my amp into my audio interface. As a result, I needed to use an amp modeler, which my favorite was this plugin, the JS Convolution Amp Cab Modeler, which comes with Reaper, using this Vox AC30 non-top boost model as the simulator, as I currently play through a Vox amp anyway, so that kind of just makes sense. If I were to play this guitar track without the amp model, it would sound like shit. But I slap that effect on, and it kind of sounds like a real guitar now. Anyway, let's look at the raw frequency spectrum of this track without any other effects aside from the modeler. So you can see that the frequency dynamics are quite leveled. There's a lot of tone in the bass because I'm chugging in this particular section. But if I were to move to a later section that's all tremolo picking, you will be able to see that the frequency spectrum on the whole is pretty level. There's a bit of a slant, and it's still kind of skewed towards the mids. But the most important thing about this spectrum here is we can see that at the high end, the treble falls off really hard around 5,000 hertz. Now, if I wanted to get a true grim, frostbitten, original Norwegian black metal sound, what I should do is scoop out most of the bass and the mids and then boost the top. Like so. Now that sounds more like something you'd expect from, like an original Norwegian black metal album. But of course, if we look at the actual EQ effects that I used, I clearly didn't do that. One of the unconventional things about my music is that I like mids, and the mid-tone knob on my amp is actually set higher than the bass and the treble. For black metal riffs, really, I just want enough treble boosted in the high end for the melody to come through, but I really want the body of my riff to still be played in that mid-range, and that's why the actual sound of this track is like so. And you can see a couple of peaks here, one around 300 and one around the 700 range, even though I've boosted on the top end just to bring that tail a little bit higher. Like with the bass demo, that's all I'm going to say on guitars for now. We're still just talking about EQ and how to use it here. The guitar mixing video will come later. So based on what I've talked about so far, I want to raise a question. What are the functions of treble and bass? Well, bass gives off a deep and full-bodied sound, but too much can make a mix sound muddy, like it's underwater, for example. In contrast, treble gives you clarity and it brightens everything up, but too much of that can make your mix sound harsh. The key to mixing is to find the right balance, and the balance really lies in the mids. The most important instruments occupy this mid-range. The snare drum, I've covered in that last video. The guitars, we've seen already. For educational purposes on mids, let's look at the vocals instead. Now, I perform a black metal style of harsh vocals, or screams, generally known as, which is thought to be on the high end, which is probably true for a singer like Isan, but it definitely varies a lot based on preference. My reference for singing is Jari Mainpa from Winter Sun, who sits more in that mid-range. Let's look at my favorite verse in this entire song. In this black metal section at the end, the line begins with twisting and turning.
Twisting and turning, suspended and thrown.
We can see that the unprocessed peak is kind of in the 1000 hertz range. And if I go and turn on all the other effects, you can see that that's exactly the point where I've decided to boost the vocals.
Twisting and turning, suspended and throws, tied to the rope, rested and tow.
Now the reason I do that and boost that spot is fairly obvious, right? I sing my vocals exactly the way I want them to sound. I have full control over that. So naturally, that's the sweet spot that I end up wanting to accentuate. Otherwise, I would go ahead and sing it in a different way. Now let's compare this to my growls, which I'll go to another one of my favorite sections, the climb or die. So despite the fact that growls are often thought of as being much deeper than regular black metal screams, if I play this frequency spectrum and we look at the raw analysis, you can see that the peaks are still in kind of the mid-range, around 600 to 800 kilohertz. So let me get these subsequent sections and play these frequency spectrums side by side so we can really get a feel for what's going on.
And still the voice inside commands, climb or die, climb or die.
So why do these two tracks sound so different? First, let's focus on the low end.
And sensei commands.
So we can see a little bit of a peak around this 200 to 300 zone.
Time or die.
And the growls kind of do the same thing. There's more towards the 100, but overall, I don't really think these two tracks look that much different from a frequency standpoint. Now, what about the top?
And still the voice inside commands. Time or die.
Now you can see a huge difference here in the treble. You can see that there's barely any peaks on some of these frequencies. 3,000 up here, around 7,000. There's a huge difference on the top end, which really does make a lot of sense from a physiological standpoint. When we do growls, we're shaping our mouth in a way that attenuates the higher frequencies, which have shorter wavelengths. The mouth is more closed and we're physically blocking these sounds from escaping. With screams, it's an open mouth technique and the whole frequency range of your voice is allowed to escape. It's really the lack of treble that is the difference between growls that make them sound deep compared to screams, which are higher up. But again, as I said before, that's enough on vocals. Effects like compression play a huge role in making vocals sound good. As you can tell from the fact that this unprocessed track is really shitty.
And still the voice inside commands.
And when I throw on my entire effects chain,
And still the voice inside commands.
it's much better. Still sounds kind of weird, but when we play it all together,
And still the voice inside commands.
and foolishly, of course, I forgot to turn on the entire effects chain for the growls, thus ruining what was supposed to be a somewhat epic moment there.
And still the voice inside commands.
So anyway, here's a summary of the big picture. Bass and treble have very important functions. Certain instruments are tied to those ranges, like the bass drum in the low end and cymbals on the top. With mids, however, I consider it to almost all be aesthetics. And honestly, the truth of EQ in general is there are no rules. It's a matter of how you want your tracks to sound. If you want to, fuck it all up, you can do whatever you want. That's not how I approach things. With my bass and black metal, I prefer natural sounds wherever possible. The key for me is to not over-process in post-production and to manage my frequency tones up front before I record so I don't have to rely so much on EQ to do all the work. With that said, there are some considerations that I think are very important when it comes to producing a clean sound. When two instruments overlap in the same frequencies, there will be a conflict. A prime example of this is the use of scooped mids in metal. So people scoop mids for the reason of achieving the aesthetics of this particular sound. But the thing is, it's not really the scooping of the mids that gives you this sound. When you scoop your mids, what you're doing is actually making your track quieter, and then you're compensating for it by boosting the volume back up. So what you've actually done in effect is you've boosted your bass and you've boosted your treble, but you've done it in a way that applies these boosts indiscriminately. It's a very evenly flat boosting of the bass and an evenly flat boosting of the treble. Meaning what you've done is you've pushed your guitars into this frequency space that's occupied by the bass drum and the bass guitar tracks, and you end up burying them in the mix. This is why I think a lot of bands that use scoop mids end up EQing their kick drum to sound super clicky. It's really the only way you can hear it. And for subgenres like tech death, where clarity in the kicks is important, it's really kind of a necessary evil if this is how you're producing your guitars. And unfortunately, for bassists like Jason Newsted, all your hard work just ends up getting drowned out because of these scooped mids. I think it's very possible to get a scooped-like sound without bringing on these penalties and drowning out your low end. You can simply just boost the bass region and then put a boost on the treble region. And by doing so, you avoid that hard conflict that you get if you just scoop your mids and boost by carving out some room on the low end and giving your kick drum and your bass some space to breathe. When I EQ my tracks, I like to give every instrument its own space. Let me go back to guitars for a sec. If we look at EQ effects, you can see as I pull up the left mid and the right treb and the left black, not that one, but that one, and the right mid, or the right black, sorry, you can see that every single one of these tracks peaks at a different frequency. For the left mid, it's 400. For the right treb, it's 1,000. For the right black, it's 2,000. And for the left black, it's 5,000. By doing it this way on my bass rhythm tracks, left mid and right treb, the left mid provides the low end that makes those chugs sound heavier, while the right treb helps define a little bit more clarity when I play melodic riffs. There's a symbiotic relationship where each guitar covers its own bass, and when combined together, you kind of get more broader strokes in achieving kind of a wider sound, as opposed to EQing all your guitars the same exact way, where it can kind of get a little bit dull and the two tracks might actually end up interfering with one another and cause phase issues. Let's go to this section here and listen for a bit. This is an atmospheric black metal type riff, and both guitars start off playing the exact same thing. What happens after 2 bars is that the guitars then split up, and actually the right treble guitar ends up going up in the harmony. So as I'm recording these sections, I'm carefully taking this into consideration. I want the track that goes into the higher harmony to sound much brighter. That way it stands out in the mix and I get more contrast as the section goes through, which is why I assigned that track to be played on the right treble, where I've boosted the higher frequencies. So let me play again that split, this time with all the tracks available. So you can hear the split right there as the higher harmony on this right treb track really just stands out more simply because it's EQ'd to sound brighter. The same rule applies to my black metal tracks as well. The left black track gets that high-end treble boost at 5k hertz for that grim, frostbitten type sound. The right black track avoids getting that much harshness by boosting the 2K instead of that higher frequencies. Let me go and play the final riffs at the end of the song. So this is a very similar situation to what was happening before. So the right black track, which is the more mid-boosted track, is playing power chords, while the left black track, on the other hand, is playing more of a black metal type melody. It's got a higher harmony, and that is synergistically assisted by the fact that it's boosted more high. Having this kind of division of labor between these instruments, I believe, is one key to creating this type of harmony and balance when you're producing your tracks. On the bridge, no two instruments step on each other's toes, as I talked about before. The kick drum takes this low bottom end at the 50 range. The snare takes this mid range at about 500. The bass takes its spot around this 1 to 200 range. I already showed how the guitars make room for one another by having their EQ settings peak at different frequencies. and the vocals are peaked to sit right in between all of that. So even there's no conflict between the guitars and the vocals. And it really just so happens that aesthetically, this is exactly how I wanted everything to sound at the end. Ultimately, EQ is about getting the sound you want. You shouldn't really compromise too much to follow any sort of hard rules, as I've talked about. You know, I often present things factually, but I don't really mean to say that this is the way that you should do it. It's really just the way that I do it because it logically makes sense to me to have things done in a certain way. And what I'm presenting is it just so happens to be what I want my music to sound like. Now, one last thing before I go. If you're a very astute observer, you might have noticed something consistently appearing on my guitar tracks as well as my vocal tracks. As I display my EQ effects again, you'll see every single one of these tracks has the very low end scooped out and the very high end scooped out. On the low end, partially the reason I do this is to free up more space for that kick drum and the bass to come through. On the high end, what I found is that those static sounding frequencies that are not very functional because the natural spectrum of the instrument has already tailed off, what they do is they end up just adding static. They end up creating noise, not sound. So by scooping these out, I found that you can really clean up your mix. So hear it for yourself as I reset this EQ and play the track. There's nothing about that sounds like guitars on the high end. It's all static. And again, as I boost up, you can hear that hiss. So by bringing it down, it takes away some of that hiss and it really makes your track sound a lot cleaner. Now listen as I do the same thing to the low end. Again, there's nothing about these low frequencies that sound like guitar. You don't really hear any guitar until I get to about 100 hertz. So there's really no reason for you to have the noise in this bottom range. I use the term functional a lot in this video in reference to tone and EQ. As I just demonstrated, these frequencies are not functional at all. They contribute nothing to your sound. In reality, they're also very quiet, but across multiple tracks, when you add multi-track guitars together, when you add your vocals, if that low end persists across all these tracks, they will sum together and very subtly affect the low end and just slightly bury that kick drum a little bit more. And by scooping them out, it really works wonders in cleaning up your sound. This was one of the most significant realizations I made when I started working on the album The Right. And I feel that this subtle effect on my EQ is actually a major contributor in pushing my production quality from very amateurish to what I call medium fidelity. And of all the techniques I've discussed in this video, the separating of the frequencies and everything, it's actually the tailing off of the low end on your tracks that don't contribute to low end in subtle manners that I hope is the one that helps you the most. And maybe it's something that you never considered before. So thank you for sticking out till the very end. That is my gift to you. And really, this is all I have to say on EQ